Bridgewater State University.
Richard, would you mind if you help me?
Okay, let's get this out.
Okay, I think it's really interesting to look at what they just did about using a case study to preserve history for business, for store, and but also fighting against gentrification. But I'm going to bring you back in history and talk about some of the earlier forms of social space that Chinese community was developing in Boston. And being in Boston, I think, is there a way to...
You want to go full screen? Why don't you go up to slideshow
Yeah. We'll just,
from the beginning?
we'll just
Here we are.
stop here.
You can handle that.
Okay, so the point of my research is that I have been involved with Boston Chinatown over the last 15 years since I moved there in 1997. I'm interested in history of Boston because Boston was one of the oldest communities in the country, but it was not considered the most studied neighborhood or community for Chinese Americans. But after moving there, I became involved with the Chinese Historical Society of New England that was founded in 1992 that connected to a group of elder and community members who were really interested in preserving the history of the community, especially trying to renovate the burial ground of Boston's old cemetery, the Chinese section of that. And so that's how the organization started. And over the last 15 years, I've been trying to document the history of old Chinatown. Because Boston was one of the earliest Chinatowns in the country, it's one of the very few that continue to be on its original site since its inception from the 1870s. A lot of other Chinatowns have moved away, and some Chinatowns have disappeared. We heard about there are a lot of Chinatowns that disappeared in the West Coast, and there's a number of them that continue on to this day, including Manhattan, you just saw, but also Boston and Philadelphia, and San Francisco, of course. So there's a lot of continuity of this neighborhood. And what I'm trying to talk about is that unlike the West Coast of the exclusion and the anti-Chinese movement, in the East Coast, the Chinese community somehow found a way to exist for over a century, despite all the obstacles that they faced and all the discrimination that they faced. And that had to do with a lot of different factors that contributed to their existence. On the one hand, the anti-Chinese sentiment was high, but it was not as violent as the West Coast. So there were less, violent events. That the Chinese were not burned, they were not killed. There were a number of times that a small number of them were killed because of different incidents of expelling the Chinese from the city, including one famous incident in 1903. But on the other hand, most of them were not persecuted. So I started the paper with 1930s, which was a turning point in the history of Boston, when the Chinese published the Chinese Directory of New England. It's also participated in the whole city parade in 1930. And so I'm trying to use these two case studies to talk about the importance of the printing press on the one hand, and the importance of public rituals or festivals for Chinese Americans to express their own identities. Previously, most of the research on Chinatown has been focusing on how the Chinese were a bachelor society. They focused on, most of the early immigrants were males, and they stayed here, and they didn't bring their wives here. They lived their very lonely life. They focused on building factories, restaurants and laundries as an occupational niche in the community. But as you just saw, there were other businesses like the grocery stores, like other merchandise stores that was also important. The Chinese did build a community and in the neighborhood and have many different businesses. And the first one was the tea trade that you saw that Boston was famous for, Chinese people selling tea. But that was certainly a controversy, whether they were the ones who were the owners of the tea stores or they were hired by people who were trying to attract customers to sell tea. Anyway, at that time, Chinese, before the 1870s, they were called Chinaman or Chinaman tea store. And there were a number of them that were shown on the S in the earlier years. So including this one on the screen here. And yes, next. I don't know how to.
Should go. Let's see.
Maybe we need to click. Is it just enter?
Yeah. Did you go? No, it didn't enter.
Connection.
Down? There we go, sorry.
No, that's
So that's one, how about up?
Is there anyone who's better with technology?
Try.
Hi, Roger. There it is, just go down, just go down. Is that what you want?
Yeah,
Yeah, this
just
one is
just
changing.
go one by one. Okay, so and of course, other than selling tea,
Next
they
one.
will also call
Right arrow.
the sell, chop
Down
suey.
or right arrow?
And the first one, and this is an ad about the Hong Fa Lo that was supposed to be opened in 1879 by this person, and this is a trade cards. A lot of them portray this person as opening up the first restaurant in Boston Chinatown in 1879, and that's the selling point at that time was the first person who made chop suey in 1879. And of course, you'll hear more about chop suey later, I think, in another paper, right? So I think that's sort of like, when the Chinese first came here, they were considered as curiosities. They were also considered as someone who were good at making certain kind of food that could attract to people. So over time, this became another way of, when they first came here, they started to occupy the neighborhood. Yes, next. So that was before the 1870s, but then, on the one hand, you could look at the ads from the newspaper. On the other hand, what did the Chinese publish? Did they have their own newspaper? Unlike San Francisco, Boston didn't have the newspaper. But we discovered that they did publish a few years the local record in the 1890s based on the printing company that we work with. One of the members of the Historical Society, grandparents, opened up a printing company and discovered a bunch of records in the 1890s, including this Chinese American Monthly News that documented a lot of products that were traded in Boston at the time. 1890 was a time when the Exclusion Act was already enacted, but the immediate effect on Boston was not as clear. So at that time, the Westerners, there were different accounts of Chinese, including the missionaries who were curious about what the Chinese were doing, including the local newspapers, the Boston Globe and other newspapers, and also including these kinds of records that we will find in the store. And what they were selling hats, they were selling other things you could tell, even if you don't read Chinese. There are pictures of hats over there. There are other things that selling liquor, selling other things, firearms and so on, and paper. So there are a lot of advertisement on the community. Next, please. This is similar to the store that we just covered before. There were a couple of grocery stores in Boston that were founded over 100 years, including this one on Beach Street, one of the main street in Boston, Chinatown. So that some of the Chinese records and advertisement would also show the Guangwalong, which was on 56 Beach Street. And if you could read Chinese, it tells you that it sells all kinds of things, including sugar, tea, rice, beans, and candies, biscuit, and seafood, groceries, clothing, porcelain, jewelry, everything, the whole kitchen sink. So ivory and so on. So this is sort of like very common. At that time, there were grocery stores in Boston in the 1890s. Yes. But what's happening, and we discovered a lot of these, we tried to restore some of these stores. When they were closed down, we recovered some of these storefronts, and this is a part of the Historical Society collection. Yes. and including the irons about what the laundries were doing. We also work with store owners and we store these kinds of artifacts, and including probably Tom's connection as well with the laundry. Now, the Western records at that time, they were looking at calling the Chinatown as the Chinese Quarter, and there were also different mixed opinions about the Chinese Quarter. One of the complaints was that Chinese Quarter was too crowded, was not sanitary, and sometimes people smoked opium. There was a lot of gambling. There was all these kinds of stereotypes against the Chinese. So there was a plan to widen the street and expel the Chinese away from Chinatown in 1893. So this is the record that is squalor and bad sanitary conditions were wanted for rapid transit. So you could see that even though they were not totally expelled, there was a plan that they wanted to kick them out on a particular street. But that plan actually resulted in widening the road and moving away a few stores. But then some of the stores were able to survive at the time. So, which is lucky for the Chinese because they were able to continue to build some of their communities there. Now, the question for the press at that time is that who are these Chinese? Are Boston Chinese becoming Americanized? Because they were fascinated by those who were assimilated. Because at that time there was once some people who were here, so they were drawing pictures about the Chinese, and if they would have kids and they were fascinated by that, they would actually report on the family life of the Chinese neighborhood of the time. So one of the questions in 1899 in Boston Globe was Boston Chinamen becoming Americanized. So you see the paradox here. On the one hand, they were considered as Chinamen, as somewhat, the stigma of an alien race. On the other hand, there's also the idea that they could become Americanized. Another concern was the missionaries when they were going into the, teaching the Chinese and making them to believe in Christianity, and they will be teaching them in Sunday schools, teaching the Bible in Sunday schools. And most of these women were female, Western Christian ladies, and sometimes they would also report things like that: labor of love, young and pretty women teach Chinese, affection display that of a Christian spirit, and so on and so forth, and repeat and talk about these kinds of missionaries. So the missionaries were the ones who were actually just like San Francisco in the West Coast, were the ones who were most sympathetic toward the Chinese and wanted them to stay. But on the other hand, they also wanted them to become Christianized and Americanized as quickly as possible. But they were also concerned about the female being mingled with the Chinese men, and they were also concerned about that. So there were scandals about that as well. We got pictures of some of the earlier missions, and these were definitely not like the press said, young and females. They were just regular, teachers, and there were no romantic relationships between the teacher and the pupils, and they were actually very stoically studying the Bible. And that's actually in Boston, Chinatown. So I did a study of the missionary schools in Boston, and they started in 1879. The first Christian mission in Boston, Chinatown was in 1915 and on Oxford Street. And this is the 16 Oxford Street. The other account is the literary account, and including the most famous Asian American writer of the time, or later on, Shui Xin-fa, and who wrote a lot of fictional accounts about Chinatown. And she's from Montreal, or she's from Scotland, and then actually lived in Canada for a long time and spent 2 years in Boston, a few years in Boston, and then wrote about the beginning of merchant families in Chinatown. And there are other accounts, like a lady called Mary Chapman also wrote an account about looks on the Chinese in Boston in 1892. And then there's also another account in 1905 that was reported in one of the newspapers. So there were a lot of writings about Boston Chinatown, and this was written in 1909. If you could see that, it's sort of like they were happy that this merchant family has 6 children. 4 of them attend American schools. And one can play a piano and sing a song. And the 5-year-old recites a Chinese version of "Now I Lay Me Down to Sleep," like a lullaby. And then the other put their sons and daughters through college. So it's sort of like, all these kinds of paradoxical kind of feelings about Chinese. And they also started to accept Chinese into the normal secondary school. And this is the old Quincy School, which was the first seated elementary school where males and females sat together in 1847, and founded by the famous educator Horace Mann. And this, we recently recognized that as the first National Historic Register site in Boston. And this is where a lot of Chinese actually started to go into to Quincy School. There's an old picture, 1902. And so, other than that, so you can see that up to 1910, there were the missionaries, the Chinese themselves, and they were all trying to talk about their own narratives. There were only very few Chinese who were there, but they were forming a Chinatown neighborhood. That was the first period of time. So the second period of time is the 1930s. And when I say the printing press, on the one hand you have the Western newspapers, on the other hand you also have a Chinese printing company. And this is the Shanghai Printing Company. And the family bought this building in 1931. And this is the father of Stephanie Fan, a board member. And he was using the old Chinese typeset and to print everything. The printing press, printing company became a center for printing things like laundry tickets, restaurant menus, and those things were the most important things that were printed in the community. And those things were critical to the community. Another importance of the written word can be seen in the community bulletin board. And in different communities, if the Chinese were present, if they don't have a newspaper, they would actually use the community bulletin board to display news about their own community in Chinatown, but also talk about national news and sometimes even international news, especially in World War II. And this became, please, and you can see a couple more examples. And this one, the next one, this is some of the notices. So that appeared until the 1950s. So about 10, 20 years ago, the city of Boston recognized that community bulletin board as an important site. We also had a recent project similar to the ones that you heard earlier. It's a multimedia project that worked with Tufts University to do 3 major highlights of Boston's Chinatown. One is the community bulletin board. The second is the Boston Chinatown, Old Chinatown Library. And what's the third one?
The Shanghai Printing Press.
And the printing press.
Printing.
Yes, the printing company. So we have these 3 projects about the printing, the importance of the written word. So I'm not covering the library here. Now, I turn to the second part. I only have 5 minutes left, probably. But the second part of my presentation is the importance of rituals in the life of Chinese community in Boston, Chinatown. One of the earliest photographs of public festivals in Chinatown was the importance of funerals on the streets of Chinatown. So before the Qing Dynasty fell in 1911, men still wore kilts, long hair, and you could see pictures in the early 1900s when there were men in Chinatown publicly holding festivals to commemorate to have the festivals before they bring the body into the coffin and bring the coffin into the cemetery. So they would do the funerals first. And yes, next one, please. And this is the most famous photograph about the importance of Chinatown cultural space in I think this is 1903. And you can see the spectators all on the street looking at the Chinese who were performing an urban funeral, kind of sacrifices for the community. Now, another form of public display of of public action is the Chinese would also commemorate people who died. Either they would parade on the street by themselves, or they would commemorate important people like Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who died in 1925. A month later, the whole community had a memorial for him outside of a building. Oh, 5 minutes, okay. Okay, the next one is if I could turn to another form of the rituals, is not just the older gentlemen, but the younger kids. They were also very active in the elementary schools. Because the Chinese language school was founded in 1916 in Boston, Chinatown, and by 1931, this picture, the Chinese kids were lining up in the graduation ceremony, and there were hundreds of them. You might say that in the exclusion period, why were there hundreds of kids? Actually, that was the first generation when they came back with paper sons, a phenomenon after the 1906 earthquake, or came into the country, or they were the ones who were actually came here with merchant status through the paper son, paper daughter. So they were active in public rituals, including the marching band, including the Boy Scouts, and we have had pictures about the Chinese American children being publicly active in performing rituals on the street. Now it gets to my main case study is 1931. The whole city was very excited when the Chinese were marching alongside with all the other ethnic groups in the founding of Boston, 300th anniversary of the founding of Boston in 1930. There's a so-called Tercentenary parade, and they were on a float. And this is the most important record of Chinese on a float before World War II. That's the first important event. There's a book devoted to the 1930 founding of Boston, 300th anniversary of the founding of Boston. And the book talks about that, I'll quote here, the most striking show of this section was that of the Chinese group with its highly colored and jeweled costumes and fantastically lovely floats. So you can see that they were dressing like an opera costume and onto the float. And this is another picture, another side of it. And another one, and when the kids were on the streets. And this is the book cover of my book about the kids standing on the street of Boston and showing their affection, kind of. And look at that, they were holding American flags. They were holding American flags, but they were Chinese. They were welcome to the celebration of the city of Boston. And the mayor of Boston also wrote a letter to the owner of Chinatown congratulating them for the development of the community as well. Now, another part of expression, I talk about men, I talk about children. How about the women? The women founded their women organizations, including the ones that were inspired by China, by Madam Chiang Kai-shek, and they founded the New England Chinese Women Association in 1935. So that's some of the pictures of their meetings. And they were also active in World War II, street protests, and they were also holding up signs about supporting America, supporting China, and boycott Japanese goods. And the young women started a lion dance troupe, and in 1938, and there was the first group of lion dance that were owned by women, and they were the Gun Club. And they participated in street parade, donations, and things like that. Next. And when China defeated Japan in 1945, they were very active in the victory celebration parades. And they were also holding their important banquet in the community. So I wanted to conclude. So I have a section about 1950s to 1970s, but I didn't actually finish that. That's actually more to do with the new kind of rituals or new kinds of printing. But you could see that the Community Bulletin Board was still active in the 50s. And of course, by the 60s, all the civil rights organizations were founded And they were certainly the written word became even more important after the 60s. But I just wanted to underscore that even before the civil rights movement, before the end of the Exclusion Act, the Chinese were never docile people who were just belong to themselves. They interacted with the larger community. They showed that they were proud of their presence in the city, and they also asserted their own space. So including the street parades on every October 10th, they would celebrate the Chinese National Day when Taiwan, they were more loyal to Taiwan at that time, when China was closed, and they would also participate in the street parades as well. So I call this a social and cultural space, or public sphere. And I'm not using Habermas's idea of public sphere to talk about civil society or a form of democracy, but I'm talking about this as a sort of kind of a social cultural space, or Chinatown social space and cultural space. I think this deserves more analysis and more study in the future.